Hi, this is Steve Hamilton presenting for CityTram. I want to start the presentation today with just a very quick opinion poll. How many of you think that buses offer an ecological benefit? That is, just with respect to fuel efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions, who here thinks buses are better than cars? Just to raise your hands, please. Interesting. Okay, thank you. Not absolutely everyone. Well, I can tell you that some of you are wrong. And by the end of this presentation, you'll know who you are. There's a common experience among the public transit agencies across America and across the various transit services they provide. They all lose money. Lots of money. The average fare box ratio nationally is less than 25%. They all lose money for the same reason. Ridership's too low. Try as we may, we just can't get the average vehicle occupancy much above 10. Now, yet we commonly observe vehicles crammed to the gills, and we even have to field customer complaints when full buses are forced to bypass stops that have waiting customers. So how can we have this experience and still have low occupancy? And why can't we get the occupancy up? The point of this presentation is to describe to you why it's so hard to get bus occupancy up. And the answer is actually pretty simple. Empty buses. Now, I use the word buses, but it's important to understand that essentially everything we operate today, regardless of technology, bus, train, or hay truck, is operated with a line haul transit architecture. Now, it's easy to understand what that means. You draw a line on a map, the route, and then you haul people up and down that line. The idea is to exploit paths commonly traveled by having multiple riders share a common vehicle. So don't let my word choice fool you. The occupancy challenge is in the line haul architecture itself. It is not specific to buses. As I said, you draw a line on a map. But if we're going to haul people both up and down that line, then the route itself must actually be a loop. So if the line length is L, then the route length is 2 times L. And if the vehicle can proceed along that loop at a velocity of v, then the time it takes to complete a single loop is 2L over v. Now, this is important because that's the natural headway. If you stand at a point along the route and measure the time from one vehicle arrival to the next, that's the headway. A rider who shows up at a stop is going to have to wait till the next vehicle arrives. That wait time will be somewhere between 0, if he's lucky, and the headway, if he's not. On average, a population of riders will experience wait times about 1/2 of the headway. And it's this wait time, almost more than anything else, that's the rider's measure of the quality of the transit service. So this equation is the key to the quality of the service we offer, so it must tell us what we can do to improve the service. To shorten the wait time, we need to either reduce the route length or speed up the vehicles. Now, shortening the route length is rarely practical. After all, the route was designed specifically to connect certain neighborhoods to other neighborhoods. We can't move those neighborhoods, so we cannot change the distance between them. And if we cut off a few of the neighborhoods from the ends of the route in order to shorten it, then we would lose the riders from those neighborhoods that the route was intended to serve. So really, increasing vehicle speed is the only option we have. But as long as buses share the road with cars, that's not practical either. The only way to increase vehicle pace is to give the vehicles an exclusive, or at least semi-exclusive path. This is why some people often claim that rail is faster, right? It's not the fact that the vehicle rolls on metal rails. It's the fact that the rails operate as an exclusive guideway. The vehicle is thus freed from the regulation of traffic lights and from congestion and other interactions with cars, bicycles, and pedestrians that would slow it down. Streetcars are proof of this, right? They operate on rails, but those rails are placed in lanes of traffic. So streetcars have to interact with the automotive and the pedestrian traffic. And streetcars are, in fact, no faster than regular vehicles. But allocating a lane exclusively for use by buses often means eliminating a lane from use by cars. This most often is an unacceptable option. So what else can we do to reduce the wait time for buses? Suppose we use the power of parallelism. Let's put a second bus on the route and position it equidistant from the first bus. This cuts the headway and the wait time in half. Now, in fact, this is a general solution. If we deploy n buses to service a route, the headway is the loop time divided by n, and the average wait time is only 1/2 of that headway. Now, while in theory this seems like a good thing because it means we can provide any level of service we want, in practice it's not really very good at all. The shape of the headway curve exhibits diminishing returns. This means often we have to have a large number of vehicles in order to achieve the desired level of service. And the line haul architecture has some really unfortunate linkages. It links service level to cost. It costs in excess of $500,000 to purchase a bus and approximately $450,000 per year to operate one. So providing better service is extremely expensive, and it's unlikely that the incremental cost will be recovered by increased ridership. I'll give you more on that later. The architecture also unhappily links service level to capacity. We get better service by adding buses, but that adds more seats. We didn't need to add more seats, but it's unavoidable. Note that we have the same number of riders and they are traveling the same number of miles. But in order for those riders to wait less, we now have n buses operating simultaneously instead of just one. So vehicle miles is n times greater. Average bus occupancy is therefore reduced, basically because we've added n-1 empty buses. Now, our ridership is not evenly distributed over the n buses at any point in time. And that's because our ridership is highly migratory. Our zoning forces it to be so. We only allow mixed-use zoning minimally. Mostly we separate residential use from commercial use and industrial use. And we typically concentrate that commercial and industrial use. We have shopping centers and business parks and downtown areas, and they're separated from residential developments and apartment complexes. So our dominant mobility need, which is that of the commute pattern, involves moving people from large, lower density residential neighborhoods into and out of the centralized, higher density commercial areas at the beginning and ending of each day. Our transit routes are then defined to access those diffuse residential areas, usually radially like the spokes of a wheel. This gives the routes a directional migratory flow. So route ridership, something like this, if more closely examined, actually looks more like this. Remember, our route is actually a loop, and so it exhibits two different directions. The morning and afternoon rush hours carry ridership in those different directions. We'd actually expect the boardings associated with the eastbound morning ridership to be spread out over a relatively larger set of stops in the residential neighborhoods. and the boardings associated with the westbound afternoon ridership to be spread over relatively fewer stops in the commercial neighborhoods. If we look at a snapshot in time during that eastbound morning flow, we see that a group of arriving riders at residential stops just missed bus number 1. Now, if that was the only bus, then they'd have to wait an entire T-loop time for the next bus. But because we have 4 buses serving the route, that's not true. They only have to wait until bus number 2 arrives. But once they board bus number 2, they are gone from the stop. Bus numbers 1, 3, and 4 continue to roll empty. Now, a little while later, new riders may show up and be carried by bus number 3. But those riders are not carried by bus numbers 1, 2, or 4. If the route is long and the residential stops are spread out over a substantial distance, then we can in fact get the riders distributed across a set of buses. But that takes quite a while to develop. And even after it does, at least half of the buses, those headed in the opposite direction to the migration, will still be empty. Overall, we just cannot escape the fact that we have the same number of riders being carried by 4 buses rather than by 1 bus. So the average number carried by each is lower. The story is the same for the westbound afternoon riders. With fewer commercial stops that are closer together, it's only the rider's arrival time at the stations that can distribute the ridership across buses. So this explains our experience. We observed bus number 1 jammed to the gills leaving the commercial station in the afternoon. But what we don't see is the other 3 buses rolling empty at that single exact same point in time. This is why average occupancy is very hard to raise. The things we do to improve the quality of the service also increase capacity and thus decrease average occupancy. Now, some people would argue that improving the quality of the service should result in an increase in ridership. Well, that's possibly true. But to offset the negative impact on the cost and occupancy, we would need that ridership increase to be at least linear by the same factor n. And this is not going to happen. First, the time needed for a transit trip is actually the sum of 3 components: the time walking, the time waiting, and the time riding. The service adjustment we described only impacts the time waiting. So not only does it scale in a diminishing 1/n terms, but the trip time impact is even less than that because the walking time and the riding time are not affected. Now, a useful metric is the ratio of trip time by existing transit versus the time for that same trip by car. Now, if this ratio is already relatively small, say maybe 1.4 as shown in the right, and with a service adjustment or improvement we can bring it down to say 1.1, then that improvement might actually get some new riders. A 10% or a 15% time penalty may be acceptable to some people in order to have a less stressful commute or a more reliable trip time, or if they can make more productive use of that travel time. But if the improvement reduces the ratio something like shown on the left, from a high number of maybe 2.1 down to 1.6, then it's really not going to change ridership very much. A 60% travel time penalty is just too high to attract car users. Unfortunately, very few transit routes in America have competitive travel times relative to car travel. So we cannot really expect wait time reductions to noticeably increase ridership, even substantial wait time reductions. Instead, such service improvements usually are used as a defensive measure to try to minimize ridership losses. But these come at a really high financial cost. It's doubtful they're worth it. The truth is, line haul architecture is simply not a cost-effective solution at the municipal level. Even though it's not a cost-effective solution, one of the arguments given for why mass transit is still a good choice for cities is the emissions benefit it offers. Remember the poll I began with? Well, there's not actually a universal answer here. You are right sometimes in some places under some conditions. According to a December 2017 report from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, our light-duty vehicles fleet in America gets on average 22.0 miles per gallon. And we mainly drive alone in America. The Census Bureau shows us that the average vehicle occupancy varies only plus or minus 0.1 across the nation from its mean of 1.2. So cars in America move people at about 26.4 passenger miles per gallon. The APTA fact book for 2017 puts the fuel efficiency for diesel, biodiesel, and compressed natural gas buses at about 3.7 miles a gallon. Now the national average for bus occupancy is 9.8. That's only about 18.8% utilization of a 52-passenger bus. But on average, buses operate then at 36.3 passenger miles per gallon and are, in fact, better than cars. But that occupancy number has wide variation across the country. So there's going to be lots of places where it's lower than 7.1, and in those places, buses are worse than cars for emissions. For example, look at Dade County. The average occupancy is only 2.3. So buses only achieve 8.5 miles per gallon and are far worse, 3 times worse than cars are for emissions. Now, vehicle technologies also impact this comparison. EVs are better than buses, even if the buses have really high occupancy. On the other hand, electric buses do well, even if the occupancy is low. Now, architecture is always more powerful than technology. So is there a better architecture than line haul? In line haul architecture, the vehicles are always moving. We use enough of them to ensure that if a rider arrives anywhere along the route, a vehicle can reach him within a headway's time. But that reach is directional. The bus only moves forward along the route. And in order to have this guarantee, all N buses must be constantly moving, even if there are no riders anywhere. Not very efficient. So rather than having the vehicles evenly spaced and moving, suppose we had the vehicles evenly spaced and stopped. And suppose we allowed the vehicle to go in either direction when a rider arrives. Then each vehicle has twice the reachability. So we could achieve the same level of headway with half as many vehicles, or half the headway with the same number of vehicles. Further, when a passenger arrives, we only need to move a single vehicle, the one closest to the rider, when a rider shows up, not all buses. And where there are no riders, no bus moves. So this lowers fuel costs and reduces emissions. This on-demand system is a better architecture. Now, as a climate actionist, this is something that I care about deeply. Buses are larger and therefore less aerodynamic vehicles than cars are. Their fuel efficiency will always be worse than that of cars. So if we're going to continue to use them, then we must exploit their capacity for higher occupancy. Otherwise, we're hurting the environment rather than helping it. The fact that we can do so in a more cost-effective manner is just icing on the cake. It allows us to do more of it. So I'm hoping you're beginning to better understand now what CityTram has been saying repeatedly. Everything we use currently for public transit implements line haul architecture. Line haul is a terrible architecture for city transit. It has very limited ability to adjust quality of service, and the adjustments it does offer pit quality of service against other very important attributes like cost and efficiency. This forces a choice that has no desirable solution. You either have to pick quality of service or affordable cost and acceptable efficiency and emissions. You cannot have both. As a result, our services are poorly utilized and emit wastefully. But we cannot abandon line haul unless we have an alternative. So I hope you also see that there is at least one, and it's a better one. It needs half as many vehicles for the same level of service, it maximizes occupancy, and it emits nothing when there are no riders. Well, thank you. I think we got a couple of minutes left, so if there are any questions people have or comments you'd like to make.